On the calm Sunday morning of December 7, 1941, the United States Pacific Fleet lay anchored at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Sailors were still waking up, the sky was clear, and no one imagined that within minutes, the world would change forever. At 7:55 a.m., the first wave of Japanese aircraft screamed down from the clouds. Torpedo bombers targeted battleships, dive bombers aimed at airfields, and fighter planes strafed soldiers who were still trying to understand what was happening. This surprise attack, planned by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, was meant to cripple the American Navy long enough for Japan to conquer the Pacific. In just over 2 hours, the Japanese destroyed or damaged 8 U.S. battleships, wrecked 200 aircraft, and killed over 2,400 Americans. President Franklin D. Roosevelt would call it a date which will live in infamy. The United States, previously hesitant to enter another global war, now had no choice. The next day, America declared war on Japan, and World War II had fully reached the Pacific. But Japan's leaders believed they had won more than just a battle. They believed they had secured dominance over the Pacific Ocean. Over the following months, Japan swept across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, capturing the Philippines, Singapore, Hong Kong, the Dutch East Indies, and Guam. The rising sun flag flew over territory stretching thousands of miles. Japanese soldiers, pilots, and sailors felt unstoppable. Yet, beneath this wave of victories, a quiet storm was forming. The United States, wounded but not broken, began to rebuild. Shipyards worked day and night repairing damaged vessels and building new ones, especially aircraft carriers, which had miraculously been absent from Pearl Harbor during the attack. These carriers, USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and USS Yorktown, would become the core of America's counterstrike. Meanwhile, in the heart of the Pacific, a small group of U.S. Navy intelligence officers sat inside a secret code-breaking station called HYPO, located in the basement of a building at Pearl Harbor. Led by Commander Joseph Rockefort, these cryptanalysts worked tirelessly to break Japanese naval codes. Their dark suits, cups of cold coffee, and sleepless eyes would soon become one of the most important reasons America would survive. By March 1942, Rockefort and his team began to notice repeated references in Japanese communications to a location called AF. What was AF? Intelligence suggested it might be Midway Atoll, a tiny U.S.-controlled island in the middle of the Pacific, just large enough for an airfield, a submarine base, and a few hundred Marines. If Japan captured Midway, it could threaten Hawaii and force the United States to surrender or negotiate. American commanders debated, but they needed proof, so they created a trap. They ordered the radio operators on Midway to send a fake message in plain English. Our water supply system is broken. 2 days later, Japanese code messages reported that AF is short on water. That was it. Confirmation. AF was Midway. Japan was coming. At the same time, Admiral Yamamoto finalized his ambitious plan, Operation MI. His goal was simple: lure the remaining U.S. carriers into a trap, destroy them, and secure Japan's control of the Pacific. His fleet was enormous: 4 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and over 250 planes. He believed the Americans were weak, demoralized, and unaware, but he was wrong. Back in Hawaii, Admiral Chester Nimitz, the calm and calculated commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, made a decision that would change history. Instead of waiting to be attacked again, he would strike first. He ordered Task Force 16 and 17, led by Admirals Raymond Spruance and Frank Jack Fletcher, to sail toward Midway and wait in secret. The Americans would not be surprised this time. They would be ready. By late May 1942, the ocean between Midway and Japan became a silent battlefield of submarines, carriers, and airplanes preparing for a clash no one could yet see. Pilots practiced dive bombing over the endless sea. Mechanics worked on aircraft engines in the humid island air. Soldiers dug trenches on the sand of Midway, surrounded by seabirds and crashing waves. The stage was set. Just 6 months after Pearl Harbor, America was no longer hiding behind damaged battleships. It was preparing to face the Japanese Navy head-on. 2 nations, 2 fleets, 2 strategies, destined to collide at a tiny atoll in the middle of the ocean. And within a few days, the course of the entire Pacific War would be decided. After the devastating success at Pearl Harbor, Japan stood at the height of its power. Its empire stretched from the shores of China to the jungles of Burma, from the Philippines to the islands of the Pacific. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, knew this momentum would not last forever. Japan had awakened a giant, the United States, and now the question was not if America would strike back, but when and where. Yamamoto believed the only way to secure long-term control of the Pacific was to defeat the U.S. Navy completely, especially its aircraft carriers. These carriers, not battleships, were now the most powerful weapons at sea. The problem for Japan was simple. The American carriers had survived Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto knew he had failed to destroy them, and that failure haunted him. Thus was born Operation MI, Japan's grand plan to lure the U.S. carriers into a trap and destroy them once and for all. The heart of the plan was Midway Atoll, a tiny coral island chain roughly halfway between Asia and the United States. Hence the name Midway. Though small, Midway was strategically priceless. If Japan captured it, they could threaten Hawaii, divide American forces, and even force the U.S. into a peace settlement. Yamamoto's strategy was bold, complex, and dangerously overconfident. His plan involved more than 200 ships, including 4 frontline aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, plus battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and supply vessels. In addition, a separate force would invade the remote Aleutian Islands near Alaska to confuse American attention. The Japanese believed the U.S. Navy would rush to defend Midway, fall into Yamamoto's ambush, and be annihilated. In April 1942, the final version of the plan was approved. But before Operation MI could begin, something unexpected happened, something that worried Yamamoto deeply. On April 18, 1942, American B-25 bombers launched from the aircraft carrier USS Hornet and struck Tokyo and other Japanese cities. This daring mission, known as the Doolittle Raid, caused little physical damage but massive psychological impact. Proved Japan was not invincible. It shattered the illusion of safety within the homeland. Yamamoto was furious and even more determined to crush the American carriers. He pushed for Operation MI to begin as soon as possible. However, there were flaws in the Japanese mindset. Their naval command believed the Americans were weaker than they really were. They assumed the U.S. had only 2 operational carriers left and lacked the courage to fight. But reality was very different. Unbeknownst to the Japanese, the Americans had already broken parts of their naval code, Jan 25. U.S. intelligence officers in Hawaii knew that AF in Japanese messages referred to Midway. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, immediately began preparing an ambush of his own. Yet the Japanese went forward confidently. In late May 1942, the First Air Fleet under Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo left Japan. On board his carriers were Japan's best naval aviators, the same elite pilots who had attacked Pearl Harbor. They expected another easy victory. Meanwhile, Yamamoto himself commanded the main fleet from his battleship Yamato, the largest warship ever built. He stayed far behind, believing his heavy guns would only be needed after the carriers had destroyed the American fleet. The Japanese believed secrecy was on their side. Their warships sailed across the Pacific in strict radio silence. Pilots practiced takeoffs and landings on carrier decks under the dark night sky. Mechanics prepared torpedoes and bombs with silent precision. Maps of Midway were studied. In their minds, the enemy was blind. But the truth was the opposite. At Pearl Harbor, American officers already knew the date, location, and approximate size of the Japanese attack force. Admiral Nimitz positioned Task Forces 16 and 17, led by Admirals Raymond Spruance and Frank Jack Fletcher, to lie in wait northeast of Midway. The Americans were outnumbered, but they had something the Japanese did not: information. Still, Japan's plan was not without danger, even for themselves. Yamamoto's forces were spread out over thousands of miles of ocean, making swift coordination nearly impossible. His fleet relied on perfect timing and absolute surprise. If either failed, the operation could collapse. By late May 1942, the trap was set on both sides. Midway's runways buzzed with American bombers being fueled and armed. Submarines slipped beneath the waves around the atoll, waiting to detect the enemy. Marine pilots lived in bunkers, listening for the first sound of aircraft engines in the distance. Thousands of miles away, Japanese carrier crews cleaned their planes, prepared torpedoes, and wrote farewell letters they hoped would never be delivered. They were confident. They believed the gods of war were with them. They did not know that they were heading into the most decisive naval battle in modern history, a battle that would not only test strategy and courage, but would decide the fate of the Pacific. While Japan was preparing its grand strategy for Midway, another battle was taking place thousands of miles away, not on the ocean, but in a dimly lit basement at Pearl Harbor. This was Station HYPO, the U.S. Navy's secret intelligence and code-breaking center. Inside, a small group of officers, mathematicians, linguists, and cryptanalysts worked tirelessly. Surrounded by typewriters, intercepted radio messages, and endless cups of cold coffee. The man at the center of this operation was Commander Joseph Rockefort. He was brilliant but unconventional. He wore a red smoking jacket, slippers, and often worked for days without sleep. His team was trying to crack the Japanese Navy's main operational code, known as JN-25. This code used over 45,000 combinations of numbers to represent words and phrases, an encryption so advanced that many believed it was unbreakable. But Rockefort did not agree. Day and night, his team studied intercepted Japanese radio traffic. Although they couldn't read every message, they began to detect patterns, identifying ship movements, dates, and references to a mysterious target called AF. Rockefort was sure that AF referred to Midway Atoll, but top commanders in Washington doubted this. Some believed the Japanese would strike Hawaii, others thought Australia was the target. To prove their theory, Rockefort and his colleague Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton created a clever deception. They asked Midway to send an unencrypted radio message saying, "Our freshwater system is damaged. We are running out of water." Japanese intelligence intercepted this message. Within 48 hours, U.S. codebreakers picked up a Japanese transmission reporting, "AF is short on water." That was the confirmation they needed. AF was Midway. This changed everything. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, trusted Rockefort completely. Armed with this intelligence, he now knew where, when, and with how many ships the Japanese would attack. Instead of being surprised, as at Pearl Harbor, America would be waiting. By late May 1942, Rockefort's team had decrypted enough messages to estimate that the Japanese attack would begin around June 4th, with 4 aircraft carriers, battleships, destroyers, and a diversionary invasion in the Aleutian Islands. This was not just useful, it was priceless. Nimitz immediately ordered his available carriers, USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and the hastily repaired USS Yorktown, to sail toward Midway and set up an ambush. Japanese commanders believed Yorktown had been sunk at the Battle of the Coral Sea, but American shipyard crews worked around the clock and repaired it in just 3 days. The ship sailed with welding sparks still flying on its decks and crews sleeping beside unfinished repairs. While American forces moved into position, Station HYPO continued listening. They intercepted messages detailing air group numbers, refueling schedules, even the call signs of the Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Every piece of information brought the U.S. closer to victory. Yet, life inside the code-breaking center was far from glamorous. The rooms were hot, filled with cigarette smoke, buzzing machines, and piles of decoded messages. Many codebreakers worked 18 hours a day, surviving on sandwiches, coffee, and determination. But they knew that every correct translation, every number decoded, might save thousands of American lives. On May 30th, 1942, Rockefort sent his final report to Nimitz. The Japanese fleet will strike Midway on June 4th. Their carriers will launch the first attack at dawn. Nimitz responded with a simple message, "Well done. Keep listening." On May 30th, 1942, Rockefort sent his final report to Nimitz. The Japanese fleet will strike Midway on June 4th. Their carriers will launch the first attack at dawn. Nimitz responded with a simple message: "Well done. Keep listening." The Japanese, confident and unaware, sailed across the Pacific in complete radio silence. They believed their codes were unbreakable. They had no idea the Americans already knew their plan. As the first days of June approached, the U.S. carriers took their hidden positions northeast of Midway. Submarines patrolled the waters. Pilots were briefed. Anti-aircraft guns were placed along the island's coast. Midway's airfield became a hive of activity. Fuel trucks, bombs, torpedoes, and crews preparing for the coming storm. And in the basement of Station HYPO, Rockefort and his men continued to listen. Every intercepted message confirmed what they already knew. Japan was walking into a trap. History would later call their work one of the greatest intelligence victories of the war. Without a single bullet fired, without a single plane launched, the battle for Midway had already begun, and the United States held the advantage. Thanks not to luck or superior firepower, but to silence, patience, and the power of intelligence. The night of June 3, 1942, was quiet over the Pacific Ocean. On Midway Atoll, American soldiers, pilots, and Marines stood ready, watching the endless horizon. They knew the Japanese were coming. They just didn't know when the first shot would be fired. Far to the northwest, the powerful Japanese First Air Fleet, commanded by Vice Admiral Nagumo, moved silently across the sea. On board the aircraft carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, pilots prepared for what they believed would be another easy victory. Just like Pearl Harbor, mechanics checked torpedoes. Crew members prayed. The rising sun flag fluttered in the early morning wind. At 4:30 a.m., June 4th, Nagumo gave the order, "Launch the first wave." Moments later, the sky filled with the roar of aircraft engines. 108 Japanese planes took off, fighters, bombers, and torpedo aircraft, heading straight for Midway. Their commander in the air was Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, one of Japan's most skilled pilots. At 5:20 a.m., a U.S. radar station on Midway detected incoming aircraft. Alarms screamed across the island. Pilots sprinted to their planes. Anti-aircraft guns rotated toward the sky. Officers shouted, "Air raid imminent. Man your battle stations." The first attack began at 6:20 a.m. Japanese bombers descended from the clouds like a swarm of hornets. The ground shook as bombs exploded across the island. Fuel tanks burned. Barracks crumbled. The airfield was torn apart. Yet, Midway's defenders refused to surrender. American Marine Corps pilots launched their outdated and slow aircraft, Brewster Buffaloes and Wildcats, to intercept the Japanese. Many knew their planes were no match for the faster Japanese Zero fighters. Still, they took to the skies without hesitation. The sky became a deadly dance of machine gun fire and smoke trails. By 6:30, many American planes were destroyed. Some never even reached altitude. On the ground, anti-aircraft gunners fought with relentless courage. They fired at every enemy aircraft in sight. Black clouds of flak burst in the sky. Several Japanese bombers were hit and plunged into the sea. Despite the destruction, Midway was not defeated. The airfield was damaged, but still usable. Communication lines were still intact. The American flag still flew above the island. Lieutenant Tominaga, leading the Japanese strike force, assessed the damage. At 7 a.m., he radioed Nagumo. Runways damaged, but still operational. A second attack is required. This message created a critical moment of decision for Admiral Nagumo. Before launching more attacks on Midway, Nagumo had armed his reserve aircraft with torpedoes, preparing to strike any American ships that might appear. Now he had a dilemma: rearm planes with bombs to attack the island again, or keep torpedoes loaded in case American carriers were near. Nagumo chose to rearm his planes for a second strike on the island. Bombs replaced torpedoes. This process was slow and dangerous. Hangar decks were filled with fuel hoses, bomb carts, and armed aircraft. One spark could have been disastrous. And while this was happening, something unexpected occurred. At 7:15 a.m., a Japanese scout plane spotted something in the distance: an American naval force. The report was delayed and unclear, but the message reached Nagumo: enemy ships present, possibly carriers. Nagumo was shocked. He had believed no American carriers were nearby. His perfect plan, based on surprise, was falling apart. Now he needed to change weapons again, from bombs back to torpedoes. But aircraft were already being refueled and rearmed. Hangars were full of explosives. Time was slipping away. Meanwhile, the Americans struck back sooner than expected. At 7 a.m., even before the Japanese planes returned, American bombers from Midway, B-26 Marauders, B-17 Flying Fortresses, and torpedo planes took off to attack the Japanese fleet. Their attacks were brave but chaotic. Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire shot down many planes. None of the bombs hit their targets. Still, these attacks did something crucial: they kept the Japanese carriers off balance. Their decks were never clear enough to launch a counterstrike. By 8 a.m., Japanese planes returned from bombing Midway, running low on fuel and ammunition. Carriers rushed to recover them. Flight decks became crowded with damaged aircraft, spilled fuel, and armed bombs. At that exact moment, unseen by the Japanese, 3 American aircraft carriers, USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and USS Yorktown, were approaching from the northeast. The Japanese had no idea. The first phase of the Battle of Midway was ending. The stage was set for the second phase, one that would decide the fate of the Pacific. And within the next hour, the hunters would become the hunted. Morning sunlight shimmered across the Pacific Ocean on June 4, 1942. The first phase of the Battle of Midway had ended with the Japanese bombing the island. Now the skies were quiet for a moment, but beneath that silence, fate was moving swiftly. 3 American aircraft carriers, USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and USS Yorktown, had taken their positions northeast of Midway. Their decks were crowded with bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters, engines trembling, waiting for the order to launch. At 7 a.m., Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, through radio commands, gave the order, "Launch every available aircraft." He knew that time was life. If the Americans struck first, there was hope. If they arrived too late, the Japanese fleet would be unstoppable. From USS Hornet, Torpedo Squadron 8, led by Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron, took off. 15 torpedo bombers, slow, outdated TBD Devastators, headed straight toward the Japanese fleet. Waldron told his men, "If any of us make it back, remember this. We did our duty." From USS Enterprise, Torpedo Squadron 6 took off. From USS Yorktown, Torpedo Squadron 3 followed. In total, 41 American torpedo bombers sped low over the ocean, flying into the most dangerous place imaginable. 4 Japanese carriers surrounded by fighters and anti-aircraft guns. But the Japanese carriers were not ready. Because of earlier attacks from Midway, their decks were crowded with refueling aircraft, bombs, torpedoes, and gasoline hoses. Admiral Nagumo was still switching weapons and had not launched his counterstrike. His fleet was powerful but vulnerable. At 9:20 a.m., Waldron's Torpedo Squadron 8 found the Japanese fleet. They attacked without fighter cover. Japanese Zero fighters pounced from above. One by one, the American planes were shot into the sea. Waldron's bomber was hit, burst into flames, and crashed into the water. All 15 aircraft were destroyed. Only one pilot, Ensign George Gay, survived. Moments later, Torpedo Squadron 6 and Torpedo Squadron 3 arrived and attacked. They too were torn apart by enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Of 41 torpedo bombers sent, 35 were destroyed. More than 100 American aviators were killed, and not a single torpedo hit a Japanese ship. It seemed like disaster, but their sacrifice was not in vain. The low-flying torpedo bombers forced the Japanese fighters to descend to sea level, leaving the skies above unprotected. And at that exact moment, like destiny, another group arrived from the clouds. From an altitude of 20,000 feet, American dive bombers from USS Enterprise and USS Yorktown VB-6 and VS-6 squadrons, led by Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, spotted the Japanese carriers. Moments earlier, they had been lost. Their fuel was running low. But McCluskey made a crucial decision. He followed a lone Japanese destroyer, Arisher, racing back to the fleet after chasing a U.S. submarine. That decision changed history. At 10:20 a.m., McCluskey's dive bombers reached the Japanese fleet. Below them, chaos. Carriers were turning in defensive circles. Flight decks were crowded with fueled aircraft and bombs. Fighters were busy down low, fighting torpedo planes. That decision changed history. At 10:20 a.m., McCluskey's dive bombers reached the Japanese fleet. Below them, chaos. Carriers were turning in defensive circles. Flight decks were crowded with fueled aircraft and bombs. Fighters were busy down low, fighting torpedo planes. McCluskey shouted, "Attack!" Dive bombers folded their wings and plunged toward the carriers at nearly 300 miles per hour. Sirens screamed. The wind roared past the cockpits. Pilots aimed their bombs through gun sights, faces tight with focus. At 10:22 a.m., bombs hit the Japanese carrier Kaga. One bomb crashed into the flight deck, exploding among refueling aircraft. In seconds, the entire deck caught fire. Bombs and torpedoes stored below erupted in chain explosions. Another group hit Akagi, Admiral Nagumo's flagship. A single 1,000-pound bomb struck near the midsection, igniting fuel and munitions. Fires spread uncontrollably. A third group struck Soryu, dropping 3 bombs that blasted through its flight deck, turning the ship into a burning inferno. In just 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 frontline carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were fatally hit. Smoke filled the sky. Japanese sailors jumped into burning oil-covered water. The Imperial Navy, undefeated until now, was stunned. Only one carrier, Hiryu, remained operational, and Hiryu was about to strike back with rage. As the dive bombers turned away, American pilots looked back and saw columns of smoke rising into the sky. They had done the impossible. The tide of the war was turning, not with battleships or luck, but with courage, code breaking, and dive bombers falling from the sky like thunder. The Americans had struck first, but the battle was not over yet. The Japanese still had one carrier left, and Hiryu was preparing to fight. Morning turned to afternoon on June 4th, 1942, and the Pacific Ocean was on fire. Within a matter of minutes, 3 of Japan's proud aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, had been struck by American dive bombers. Thick pillars of black smoke rose into the sky as sailors scrambled across burning decks. But the battle for Midway was not over yet. One Japanese carrier still remained operational. Hiryu, Admiral Chester Nimitz, standing aboard the cruiser Nagara, watched in horror as flames consumed the heart of his fleet. The once invincible Kido Butai, Japan's elite carrier strike force, was now crippled. Yet Nagumo refused to surrender. He ordered Hiryu to launch every available aircraft in a desperate counterattack. Soon, 18 Val dive bombers and 60 fighters roared into the sky, heading toward the damaged USS Yorktown. At 2:30 p.m., the Japanese dive bombers broke through American defenses. Yorktown's crew fought bravely, guns blazing, damage control teams at the ready. But 2 bombs slammed into the deck, igniting fires and destroying boilers. The carrier slowed and began to list. Minutes later, Japanese torpedo bombers delivered the final blow. 2 torpedoes struck her side. The once proud Yorktown went dead in the water. Sailors jumped into the sea as smoke and flames rose from her decks. Hiryu's moment of triumph was brief. American reconnaissance aircraft spotted her lone position in the afternoon sun, about 150 miles northwest of Midway. Orders were given to launch a final strike. From the decks of USS Enterprise and USS Hornet, squadrons of SBD Dauntless dive bombers took off once again. These were the same men who had destroyed the Japanese carriers that morning. Now they were flying to finish the job. As they approached Hiryu around 5 p.m., the sky was clear, the sea calm, perfect conditions for attack. The carrier's crew had just recovered a few returning aircraft when the alarm sounded, "Enemy dive bombers incoming." Sailors rushed to fire guns. Pilots sprinted to their planes. But it was too late. The dauntless bombers rolled into steep dives, engines howling, wind screaming against their canopies. For bombs struck Hiryu. One tore through the flight deck and exploded in the hangar among fuel hoses and fully armed planes. The impact triggered a chain of explosions. Flames shot 50 meters into the air. Within minutes, Hiryu was burning from bow to stern. Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, refusing to abandon his ship, ordered the crew to evacuate while he and Captain Tomio Kaku remained aboard. As night fell, Hiryu's fires lit the dark sea like a floating torch. Meanwhile, the other carriers were already doomed. Kaga's flight deck was a sea of flame, munitions cooking off one after another. Her bridge crew was wiped out in seconds. Soryu, struck by 3 bombs, suffered catastrophic internal explosions. Her surviving crew leaped into oil-covered water to escape the inferno. Akagi, the flagship of the Pearl Harbor attack, was hit by a single bomb, but that bomb landed perfectly, igniting fueled aircraft, fuel lines, and torpedoes. By sunset, her engines failed, and she drifted helplessly. Admiral Nagumo transferred his flag to a destroyer. His command was gone. As night approached, he sent a heartbreaking message to Tokyo. 3 carriers badly damaged. Situation critical. Through the night, Japanese destroyers attempted to scuttle the ruined carriers. Many sailors refused to leave their ships, choosing instead to go down with them. Akagi was abandoned at 4:30 a.m. on June 5th and sunk by torpedoes. Kaga followed shortly after. Soryu sank beneath the waves, taking over 700 crewmen with her. Hiryu, after burning throughout the night, finally slipped beneath the sea early on June 5th. Admiral Yamaguchi and Captain Kaku stood on the deck as she went down, saluting their nation. The ocean grew quiet again, but everything had changed. In one day, Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, over 250 aircraft, and many of its top naval aviators, men who had trained for years and could never be replaced. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once the most feared in the world, would never again regain the strength it had at Midway. For the United States, the victory came at great cost. Yorktown was sinking, and many brave pilots never returned. But the tide of the war had turned. From the burning wrecks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu rose a new reality. Japan's advance had ended. America was now on the offensive. The morning after the Battle of Midway, the waters of the Pacific were strangely calm. The smoke had cleared. The sounds of torpedoes and explosions had fallen silent. But beneath the waves lay the shattered remains of 4 Japanese fleet carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Oil slicks stretched across the ocean surface. Life rafts drifted silently, carrying exhausted sailors who had survived fire, explosions, and the cold sea throughout the night. For the United States Navy, the victory came at a cost. The aircraft carrier USS Yorktown, already damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea, had been struck again by bombs and torpedoes from planes launched by Hiryu. Her crew fought bravely to keep her afloat. Fires were contained, and listing was corrected. But on June 6th, a Japanese submarine, I-168, slipped past American destroyers and fired torpedoes. One struck the destroyer USS Hammond, which broke in half and sank in minutes. Two more torpedoes ripped into Yorktown's weakened hull. The carrier slowly rolled onto her side. On June 7, 1942, she sank beneath the ocean. Yet even in sinking, Yorktown had done her duty. She bought time. She absorbed attacks that might have struck another American ship. In total, the Japanese Navy lost over 3,000 men, many of them elite pilots and experienced crew. The loss of these aviators was more devastating than the loss of the ships themselves. Japan had no way to quickly replace them. American pilot training programs, by contrast, were expanding. New factories were producing ships and aircraft at a speed Japan could not match. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet, was heartbroken. He had once warned his government that Japan could run wild for 6 months to a year, but after that, he could promise nothing. Now, 6 months after Pearl Harbor, his warning had come true. In silence, he ordered his fleet to retreat to Japan. He would never again command a decisive offensive in the Pacific. News of the victory at Midway spread across the United States. President Franklin D. Roosevelt received the message. This operation was a complete victory. Newspapers printed headlines like, "Japanese carrier fleet destroyed," and "Midway is ours." For the first time in the war, Americans felt hope. Families who had lost fathers, sons, and brothers at Pearl Harbor began to believe that the tide was turning. At Midway Atoll itself, U.S. Marines and Navy personnel began to bury the dead, repair damaged runways, and clear unexploded bombs. Seagulls flew over silent gun emplacements. The coral beaches, still marked by craters, became a symbol of sacrifice and survival. The small island, only 2 miles across, had become the line between victory and defeat in the Pacific. Strategically, the Battle of Midway was more than just a naval victory. It was the turning point of the Pacific War. Before Midway, Japan had been on the offensive, capturing territory from Southeast Asia to the Central Pacific. After Midway, the balance of power shifted. Japan's naval air power was crippled. Its expansion stopped. From this point forward, Japan would fight defensively, trying to hold onto what it had conquered. The United States, meanwhile, began planning its counteroffensive. Just 2 months later, American Marines landed on Guadalcanal, beginning the long island-hopping campaign toward Japan. New carriers like USS Essex and USS Independence were launched. Factories in Detroit, New York, and California worked day and night to build planes, ships, and weapons. The sleeping giant had fully awakened. Historians often compare Midway to other decisive battles in history: Trafalgar, Salamis, Hastings. Each marked a shift in global power. At Midway, the age of Japanese naval dominance ended, and the era of American power in the Pacific began. In just 1 day of battle, 4 ships and a generation of skilled Japanese aviators were lost. Losses Japan could never recover from. Yet the legacy of Midway is not just about ships and strategy. It is about the courage of individuals. Pilots who flew through clouds of anti-aircraft fire. sailors who stayed at their posts as flames surrounded them, intelligence officers who cracked enemy codes, engineers who patched wounded ships while bombs fell around them. Their efforts combined changed the course of history. As the sun set on June 7, 1942, the Pacific Ocean was quiet again. But it was not the same ocean as before. Beneath its waves lay the wrecks of pride, ambition, and empire. Above its surface sailed a new sense of purpose and hope. The Battle of Midway did not end the Second World War, but it changed its direction forever.